On a Tuesday afternoon in late May 1980, the mailman delivers a letter to a small house on Banning Street in Winnipeg, Manitoba. The house belongs to James Fenton. He is 60 years old. He is retired from the Canadian Pacific Railway. He has a wife named Margaret, 3 grown children, and a filing cabinet in the basement that contains 35 years of correspondence, all of it leading nowhere. He has spent more than half his life searching for a man he met for 12 minutes in the sky over Germany. The letter has a foreign stamp. The return address is a small town in Bavaria called Preenam Chiemsee. The handwriting is neat and careful, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who learned penmanship with an ink pen and a ruler. Fenton takes the letter inside. His hands are trembling. He sits down at the dining table, the same spot where he has written hundreds of letters over 35 years, and opens the envelope. Inside is a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. The letter is written in English, correct but slightly formal, the English of someone who learned it as a second language and has practiced it carefully. It begins with 5 words that stop his heart. I believe I am him. Fenton puts the letter down. He stares at the wall. His hands are shaking so badly he cannot hold the paper steady. For 35 years he has been searching for a ghost. A German fighter pilot who appeared on his wing over Bremen in December 1944 escorted his shattered bomber to safety, saluted, and disappeared into the gray winter sky. He has written to archives in Ottawa, London, Washington, and Koblenz. He has traveled to Germany. He has placed notices in aviation magazines. He has contacted every veterans association he could find on 2 continents. And every time the answer was the same. Nothing. No record, no name, no trace. Now, on a Tuesday afternoon in Winnipeg, the ghost has written back. But to understand why those 5 words carried the weight of 35 years, we need to go back to a December morning in England, where a 22-year-old flight sergeant from Winnipeg climbed into a bomber and flew into the worst sky in the world. December 17, 1944. The briefing room at Royal Canadian Air Force Station, Middleton Street, George in County Durham, England, smells like wet wool, cigarette smoke, and cold tea. 42 airmen sit on wooden benches, their breath visible in the freezing air, because the heating pipes burst 3 days ago, and nobody has come to fix them. Outside, a gray English dawn is crawling over the runway, where 14 Avro Lancaster bombers are being fueled and armed for a daylight raid on Bremen, Germany. Flight Sergeant James Fenton sits in the 3rd row. He is 22 years old, from Winnipeg, Manitoba, the youngest of 4 brothers, and the only one who volunteered for Bomber Command. His older brother Robert tried to talk him out of it. Bomber Command has the highest casualty rate in the entire Allied military. More than half the men who fly these missions will not survive their tour. The average life expectancy of a Lancaster crew in late 1944 is roughly 5 operations. Fenton is about to fly his 19th. He already knows what the target is before the intelligence officer pulls back the curtain on the wall map. The red yarn stretches from Middleton, St. George across the North Sea, over the Frisian Islands, and terminates at a dot on the German coast. Bremen, again. The room groans. Bremen is one of the most heavily defended cities in northern Germany. It bristles with over 200 anti-aircraft guns, and the Luftwaffe keeps at least 3 fighter squadrons within scrambling distance. Every crew in a 428 squadron has lost friends over Bremen. The intelligence officer runs through the details. Primary target is a Focke-Wulf aircraft production facility on the southern edge of the city. Secondary target is the railway marshalling yards. Bomb load is a mix of high explosive and incendiary. Expected cloud cover is 60%, which means they will probably have to bomb through gaps using the Pathfinder markers dropped by the lead aircraft. flak will be intense. Fighter opposition is expected to be moderate to heavy, depending on how quickly the Luftwaffe can scramble from the airfields at Oldenburg and Akmer. The weather officer takes over. Winds at bombing altitude will be from the northwest at 35 knots. Temperature at 20,000 feet will be minus 38 degrees. Frostbite conditions for any exposed skin in under 90 seconds. The gunners, who sit in open turrets with the wind screaming past them for hours, exchange glances. They know what minus 38 feels like. It feels like your fingers are being slowly crushed in a vice. Fenton copies down the coordinates, the radio frequencies, the emergency procedures. He notes the rally point where the formation will reassemble after the bombing run, and the heading for the return leg across the North Sea. He writes neatly in the small, precise handwriting his mother taught him at the kitchen table in Winnipeg when he was 6 years old. He folds the paper and puts it in his breast pocket, next to the photograph of his girlfriend Margaret, who works at the Eaton's department store on Portage Avenue, and writes him a letter every Tuesday. After the briefing, Fenton walks across the tarmac to his aircraft. Lancaster Mark III, serial number KB726, known to the crew as Prairie Ghost because someone painted a white bison skull on the nose after their 7th mission, and the ground crew said it looked like a ghost floating across the prairie. The name stuck. His crew is already there, going through their pre-flight checks. 7 men who have become closer than brothers over the past 4 months. Flying Officer Duncan Brody, the navigator from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, a former mathematics teacher who can calculate wind drift in his head faster than most men can read a compass. Pilot Officer Samuel Atchison, the bomb aimer from Halifax, Nova Scotia, who played semi-professional hockey before the war, and still walks with a slight limp from a knee injury he got in a game against Moncton. Sergeant William Mackey, the wireless operator from Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, the quietest man on the crew, who speaks only when he has something worth saying and spends his free time reading poetry he borrows from the station library. Flight Sergeant Henri Doucet, the flight engineer from Trois-Rivières, Quebec, who can diagnose an engine fault by sound alone and once kept a failing Merlin running for 40 minutes through sheer force of will and a wrench. Sergeant Thomas Pickering, the mid-upper gunner from Thunder Bay, Ontario, a former lumberjack with forearms like fence posts who claims he joined the Air Force because he was tired of being cold in Canadian winters, which everyone agrees is the worst reason ever given for joining Bomber Command. And Sergeant Andrew Lewicki, the rear gunner from Edmonton, Alberta, the son of Polish immigrants who sits alone in the tail turret for hours at a time, 4,000 feet of empty air beneath him, watching for fighters that come out of the darkness like sharks. Fenton climbs into the cockpit and begins his own checks: instruments, throttles, fuel gauges, hydraulic pressure, oxygen flow. Everything reads normal. He runs the engines up to full power, listening for any roughness in the 4 Rolls-Royce Merlins, each producing over 1,400 horsepower. They sound clean. He pulls the throttles back and waits. At 700 hours, the first Lancaster begins its takeoff roll. Fenton is 4th in line. When his turn comes, he pushes the throttles forward, feels the aircraft shudder and strain against its own weight, and then they are rolling, accelerating, the runway markers flashing past, and then the wheels leave the ground and the weight falls away and they are climbing into the gray English sky. The formation assembles over the North Sea, 14 Lancasters from 428 Squadron, joined by another 18 from 419 and 424 squadrons. 46 bombers in total, a mid-sized force by late war standards. They climb to 20,000 feet and level off, the engine settling into their cruise rhythm, the airframe vibrating with a steady, bone-deep hum that Fenton has learned to find almost comforting. almost. The first hour passes without incident. Below them, the North Sea is a flat gray sheet that stretches to every horizon. There is no visible boundary between the water and the sky. The world is simply gray in every direction, at every altitude. The cold is savage. Even inside the cockpit, with the heating system running at full capacity, Fenton can feel it pressing through his flight suit, his gloves, his boots. The gunners in their open turrets have it far worse. Pickering, in the mid-upper turret, stamps his feet against the metal floor every 30 seconds to keep the blood moving. Lewicki, in the rear turret, has already lost feeling in his fingertips. Brody calls out the navigation checkpoints. They cross the Frisian Islands on time, exactly where they should be. The Dutch coast passes beneath them, flat and featureless under a thin layer of cloud. Then they are over Germany, and everything changes. The flak starts before they can see Bremen. Black puffs of smoke appear in the sky ahead of them, scattered at first, then thickening into a wall. The German gunners have their altitude and their heading. The shells burst in patterns designed to fill specific volumes of sky with shrapnel. The technique is called box flak, and it is devastatingly effective. Each burst throws out hundreds of razor-edged metal fragments at velocities that can punch through aluminum like paper. Fenton holds his course. This is the part he hates most. The straight and level approach to the target, where you cannot deviate, cannot weave, cannot do anything except fly directly into the wall of explosions and hope that nothing hits you. The Lancaster shudders as a burst detonates close to the port wing. Shrapnel rattles against the fuselage like gravel thrown against a tin roof. Another burst, closer. The aircraft lurches sideways. Fenton corrects, holds the heading. Then they are over the target. Atchison, lying flat in the bomb aimer's position in the nose, calls out corrections. Left, left, steady. The Pathfinder markers are burning on the ground below, bright red flares that look almost festive against the gray landscape. The bomb bay doors are open. The aircraft is slightly nose-heavy with the added drag. Bombs gone. The Lancaster surges upward as 12,000 pounds of high explosive and incendiary bombs fall away from the fuselage. Fenton banks hard to port, beginning the turn away from the target. This is the second most dangerous moment of any bombing mission. The formation is breaking up as individual aircraft turn and dive for speed, and the flak gunners know exactly where they will be. The first hit comes from below. A flak burst detonates directly beneath the starboard wing, and the concussion slams the aircraft sideways like a giant hand slapping a toy. Warning lights flash across the instrument panel. The number 3 engine is on fire. Doucet is already moving, pulling the fire extinguisher handle, feathering the propeller, shutting down the fuel supply. The fire dies. 3 engines remaining. Fenton pushes the nose down, trading altitude for speed. The formation is ahead of them now, pulling away. A Lancaster on 3 engines cannot keep up with the group. They are falling behind, and in the skies over Germany, falling behind is a death sentence. A lone bomber is a target. The fighters know it. The flak gunners know it. The second hit comes 30 seconds later. Another burst, this one directly ahead, and shrapnel tears through the nose section. Atchison screams. Brody shouts something that Fenton cannot hear over the noise. The cockpit fills with a blast of freezing air as a hole the size of a dinner plate opens in the fuselage above Fenton's head. The windscreen cracks, but holds. More warning lights. Hydraulic pressure is dropping. The number 1 engine is running rough, vibrating badly enough to shake the entire airframe. Mackey's voice comes over the intercom, tight and controlled. Atchison is hit, shrapnel in his right leg and torso. Brody is applying pressure, but there is a lot of blood. Lewicki reports from the rear turret that two fighters are forming up behind them about 2,000 yards out and closing. Messerschmitt Bf-109s. The fighters hit them like a thunderstorm. Cannon shells walk across the fuselage from tail to nose. Lewicki fires back from the rear turret, his 4 Browning machine guns hammering in short, disciplined bursts. Pickering swings the mid-upper turret and opens fire on the second fighter as it breaks high. The Lancaster shudders under the impacts. More holes in the fuselage. The number 1 engine dies completely, trailing a thin stream of white smoke. 2 engines now. The aircraft is losing altitude steadily, sinking toward the clouds below. The fighters come around for a second pass. This time, a cannon shell hits the rear turret. Lewicki stops firing. Pickering calls over the intercom. Lewicki's hit. He's not moving. Fenton feels something cold settle in his chest. Andrew Lewicki, from Edmonton, who showed him photographs of his parents' bakery on White Avenue and talked about opening his own shop after the war. Andrew, who sat in that freezing turret for hours without complaint, who once said the cold reminded him of waiting for the bus on Jasper Avenue in January. The fighters make a third pass, but this time Pickering drives them off with a sustained burst that clips the lead aircraft's wing. The 2 Messerschmitts break away, either damaged or low on ammunition. For a moment, there is silence except for the sound of 2 laboring engines and the wind screaming through the holes in the fuselage. Fenton takes stock. 2 engines running, one of them badly. Hydraulics failing. Oxygen system destroyed. Navigator wounded. Bomb aimer critically wounded. Rear gunner unconscious or dead. The aircraft is at 8,000 feet and descending. They are somewhere over northern Germany, at least 150 miles from the coast, alone, crippled, and visible to every German with a pair of binoculars. He turns to Doucet. Can we make it? Doucet looks at the gauges, does the math in his head. He says maybe. If the number 4 engine holds, if the fuel lines are not damaged, if they can nurse the aircraft to the coast without losing any more altitude. Maybe. Fenton nods. Then we fly. He points the nose northwest, toward the North Sea, toward England, toward home. The Lancaster groans and shudders beneath him, but it keeps flying. 2 engines, a shattered fuselage, a dying crew, and a 22-year-old kid from Winnipeg who is too stubborn to quit. They have been flying for approximately 40 minutes when Pickering's voice comes over the intercom. Calm, quiet, the way a man speaks when he is trying very hard not to panic. Skipper, fighter, port wing, close. Fenton looks left and his heart stops. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 is sitting on their port wingtip, no more than 50 feet away. Close enough that Fenton can see the pilot's face through the canopy. Close enough to read the markings on the fuselage. The fighter is not firing. It is simply there, holding formation, matching their speed perfectly. The German pilot is looking directly at him. For a long moment, nothing happens. The 2 aircraft fly side by side through the gray December sky. The crippled Canadian bomber and the sleek German fighter separated by 50 feet of frozen air. Fenton waits for the cannon flash that will end his life. It does not come. Instead, the German pilot raises his hand. He points downward, toward the ground. Land. He is telling Fenton to land, to surrender, to save what is left of his crew by putting the aircraft down on German soil, where they will become prisoners of war, but at least they will be alive. Fenton shakes his head. The German pilot points north. Sweden. Neutral territory. If they can make it to Sweden, the crew will be interned, but they will receive medical treatment. Atchison might survive. Fenton looks at his compass. Sweden is northeast. England is northwest. He has been pointing this aircraft toward England since the moment the first shell hit them, and he is not going to stop now. He shakes his head again. The German pilot stares at him for a long time. Then he does something that Fenton will remember for the rest of his life. He pulls ahead of the Lancaster and settles into a position just off the port bow, slightly above, clearly visible to anyone watching from the ground. He is flying in formation with them. And as they approach the German coastline, where the anti-aircraft batteries are waiting, the guns fall silent. The flak crews see a Bf-109 flying escort on a bomber and assume it is a captured aircraft on a special mission. They hold their fire. For 12 minutes, the German pilot guides the shattered Lancaster through the most dangerous stretch of sky in northern Europe. He stays with them past the coastal batteries, past the last islands, all the way to the open water of the North Sea. When there is nothing below them but gray waves, the German pilot draws alongside one final time. He looks at Fenton, 22 years old, bleeding from a cut above his eye, hands locked on the controls, flying a dead aircraft on 2 failing engines, with half his crew wounded or dying behind him. The German pilot raises his hand in a slow, careful salute. Then he banks his fighter to the left, drops below the cloud layer, and vanishes. Fenton stares at the empty sky where the German was. Pickering's voice comes over the intercom. "Skipper, was that real?" Fenton does not answer. He turns back to his instruments and flies. 47 minutes later, the Lancaster Prairie Ghost touches down at an emergency airfield at Royal Air Force Woodbridge in Suffolk. The landing gear collapses on contact with the runway, and the aircraft slides 500 feet on its belly, before grinding to a stop in a shower of sparks and torn metal. Fire crews are already racing toward them. The aircraft will never fly again. They pull the crew out one by one. Atchison is unconscious, his flight suit soaked with blood. He will survive, but he will lose his right leg below the knee. Lewicki is carried from the rear turret on a stretcher. He is alive, barely, with shrapnel wounds to his head and chest. He will spend 4 months in hospital and walk with a cane for the rest of his life. Brody has a broken collarbone from being thrown against the navigation table during the fighter attack. Mackey has second-degree burns on his hands from a fire in the wireless compartment that he put out with his bare palms. Pickering and Doucet are shaken but unhurt. Fenton has a deep cut above his left eye and cannot hear properly out of his right ear. 7 of the 7 surviving crew walk or are carried away from the wreckage. At the debriefing, Fenton tells the intelligence officer everything: the flak, the fighters, the damage, the casualties, and then he tells him about the German pilot. The Bf-109 that appeared on their wing, the signals to land or divert to Sweden, the escort through the coastal batteries, the salute. The intelligence officer listens without expression. He writes it down in his notes. Then he looks up at Fenton and says 6 words that will shape the next 35 years of his life. Do not speak of this again. The reason is simple. The Allied war effort depends on a clear narrative. The Germans are the enemy. They are ruthless, fanatical, and incapable of mercy. If word spreads that a German fighter pilot deliberately spared a crippled bomber and its crew, it complicates that narrative. It makes the enemy human. It creates sympathy where there should be none. It could undermine the morale of other bomber crews who need to believe that the men trying to kill them are monsters, not human beings capable of compassion. Fenton understands. He nods. He walks out of the briefing room and into the gray English afternoon, and he does not speak of it again. Not to his crew, not to his squadron mates, not to anyone. But he does not forget. The war ends 5 months later. Fenton flies 3 more operations before his tour is complete, and then he is sent home on a troop ship that docks in Halifax in June 1945. He takes the train across Canada, watching the landscape change from the forests of Nova Scotia to the flatlands of Quebec to the endless prairie that opens up west of Sudbury. When the train pulls into Union Station in Winnipeg, his mother is waiting on the platform. She is smaller than he remembers. She holds him for a long time and does not say anything. He does not tell her about the German pilot. He does not tell Margaret either, even though she meets him at his mother's house that evening, wearing the blue dress he always liked, and carrying a bottle of rye whiskey she bought with her own money from the Eaton's employee store. They sit on the back porch and drink from mismatched glasses and listen to the mosquitoes, and he tells her about England, about the countryside, about the pubs and the fish and chips and the people who sheltered them. He does not tell her about the flak or the fighters or the freezing cockpits or the friends who died. And he does not tell her about the German pilot who appeared on his wing like a ghost and escorted them to safety. Some things do not translate from the sky to the ground. He marries Margaret in September 1946 in a small ceremony at Knox United Church on Edmonton Street. His brother Robert is best man. The reception is held in his mother's backyard, and his uncle plays the fiddle while the neighbors dance on the grass. It is a warm autumn evening, and for a few hours the war feels very far away. He takes a job with the Canadian Pacific Railway, working as a dispatcher at the yard office on Higgins Avenue. It is steady work, predictable work, the kind of job that lets you come home at the same time every evening and know exactly what your paycheck will be at the end of the month. He and Margaret buy a small house on Banning Street in Wolseley, a quiet neighborhood of elm-lined streets and clapboard houses where everyone knows their neighbors and children play hockey on the frozen river in winter. Their first child, a daughter named Catherine, is born in 1948. A son, Robert, named after Fenton's brother, arrives in 1951. A second son, David, comes in 1954. The house on Banning Street fills with noise and laughter and the chaos of 3 children under the age of 6, and Fenton discovers that fatherhood is the most terrifying thing he has ever experienced, including flying a crippled bomber over Germany. From the outside, he is building a perfectly ordinary Canadian life. He coaches hockey on Saturday mornings at the community rink on Westminster Avenue, teaching 8-year-olds how to skate backward and handle a puck. He helps his neighbor build a fence in the summer. He takes his family to the lake in Whiteshell Provincial Park every August, where they swim and fish and sleep in a canvas tent that leaks when it rains. He goes to work, comes home, eats dinner, reads the newspaper, falls asleep in his chair watching Hockey Night in Canada. But the nightmares never stop. Margaret learns this in the first week of their marriage. She wakes in the middle of the night to find her husband sitting bolt upright in bed, drenched in sweat, staring at something she cannot see. His breathing is ragged, fast, the breathing of a man in a cockpit over Bremen. She reaches for him, and he flinches, and for a split second his eyes are not the eyes of a 24-year-old newlywed in Winnipeg. They are the eyes of a 22-year-old pilot watching shells burst around his aircraft. The nightmares come 2 or 3 times a month, sometimes more, sometimes less. They follow no pattern. They can arrive after a good day or a bad day, in winter or in summer, after an evening of laughter or an evening of silence. Margaret learns not to wake him suddenly. She learns to speak his name softly, to place her hand on his arm, and wait for him to come back from wherever he's gone. The children learn too. Catherine, the eldest, develops an instinct for it. When she hears her father's restless breathing through the thin walls of the house on Banning Street, she lies very still in her bed and waits for it to pass. She does not ask about it, because she tried once when she was 9, and her father changed the subject with a quickness that told her everything she needed to know. There are places inside her father that she is not allowed to visit. What none of them know is that underneath all the standard nightmares of flak and fighters and dying crew, there is one image that recurs more than any other. It is not the explosion that killed his engine, or the moment the shrapnel tore through the nose. It is the German pilot, the face through the canopy, the hand raised in salute, the Bf 109 peeling away into the gray sky and disappearing. Who was he? The question begins as a whisper and grows over the years into something louder. Fenton thinks about it at work, staring at the rail schedules on his desk. He thinks about it on winter nights when the cold rattles the windows of the house on Banning Street and reminds him of the cockpit over Germany. He thinks about it when his children ask what he did in the war, and he says, "I flew bombers," and changes the subject. He wonders if the German pilot survived the war. By December 1944, the Luftwaffe was being bled white. Pilots were being sent into combat with fewer than 50 hours of flight training. The kill ratio had turned savagely against them. For every Allied bomber they shot down, they lost 3 or 4 fighters. The average life expectancy of a German fighter pilot in the final months of the war was measured in weeks. The German pilot who spared him might have been killed the next day, or the next week, or in the final chaotic collapse of the Reich in April 1945. He might have died in a dogfight over Berlin, or been strafed on the ground by a P-51 Mustang, or been shot by his own side for some real or imagined act of cowardice. He might be buried in an unmarked grave somewhere between Bremen and the Baltic, or he might be alive. He might be living in a rebuilt Germany, working in a factory or teaching school, or running a small business. He might be sitting in a kitchen somewhere, staring out a window, remembering the same December afternoon that Fenton remembers. He might be wondering the same thing Fenton wonders. Did the bomber make it home? Did the crew survive? Fenton does not know. And the not knowing gnaws at him in a way that the standard memories of combat do not. The flak, the fighters, the cold, the fear. These are things he shares with thousands of other men who flew bombers over Germany. They are terrible memories, but they are common memories, the currency of a generation that went to war. The German pilot is something else entirely. The German pilot is a mystery that belongs to Fenton alone, a private haunting that he cannot share because he was ordered not to speak of it. In 1955, 10 years after the war, Fenton breaks his silence for the first time. He does not tell anyone. He simply sits down at the kitchen table one evening after Margaret and the children have gone to bed, and he writes a letter. He addresses it to the Records Division of the Royal Canadian Air Force in Ottawa. He describes the date, the mission, the damage to his aircraft. He asks if there are any records that might identify the German fighter pilot who escorted them to safety. The response arrives 3 weeks later, a single page on official letterhead. The Records Division has no documentation of such an incident. They suggest he contact the British Air Ministry. He writes to the British Air Ministry. The response takes 2 months. They have no relevant records. He tries the United States Army Air Force Historical Office, thinking that American intelligence might have captured German records that the British and Canadians do not have. Another dead end. He puts the letters in a folder, puts the folder in a drawer, and closes it. He does not try again for 7 years. In 1962, he writes to a Luftwaffe, Veterans Association in West Germany. He does not know the name of the pilot, the unit, or the exact airfield. All he can offer is a date, a location, and a description of what happened. The association writes back politely. They have many members, but without more specific information, they cannot help. He tries again in 1968, writing to a different veterans group. Same response. In 1971, he contacts a historian at the Imperial War Museum in London who specializes in Luftwaffe operations. The historian is sympathetic, but explains that German military records from the final year of the war are fragmentary at best. Many unit diaries were destroyed in the bombing or burned by retreating troops. Others were captured by the Soviets and are locked in archives in Moscow. Finding one specific pilot from one specific mission on one specific day is, he writes, like searching for a needle in a field of haystacks. Fenton reads that letter at the kitchen table and puts it back in its envelope. Margaret, who has watched him write these letters for years without ever asking what they are about, finally asks, "What are you looking for, James?" He looks at her for a long time. Then he tells her the whole story from beginning to end. The crippled bomber, the German fighter on the wing, the signals to land, the escort through the flak batteries, the salute over the North Sea. He tells her about the intelligence officer's order to never speak of it again. He tells her about the nightmares that always end in the same place, with the German pilot banking away into the gray sky. And he tells her about the question that has followed him for 27 years. Who was he? Margaret listens without interruption. When he finishes, she is quiet for a full minute. Then she says something that changes the nature of the search. She says, "You are not going to find him by writing letters to bureaucrats. You need to find the pilots themselves." She is right, and Fenton knows it. But in 1971, he does not know how. The pilots are scattered across a divided Germany. Many have changed their names or moved to other countries. Many are dead. The ones who survived are in their 50s and 60s now, pensioners and grandfathers, men who have spent a quarter of a century trying to forget the same war that Fenton cannot stop remembering. So the search continues slowly, fitfully, a letter here, a phone call there, year after year, decade after decade. Fenton retires from the railway in 1978 at the age of 56. His children are grown. Catherine is a teacher in Ottawa. Robert is an engineer in Calgary. David is studying law at the University of Manitoba. The house on Banning Street is quiet now. Margaret still works part-time at the Winnipeg Free Press, where she has been an assistant in the classified advertising department for 20 years. Fenton fills his retirement with the search. He subscribes to aviation history magazines from Britain, Germany, and the United States. He joins veterans organizations. He attends reunions. He travels to Ottawa to visit the National Archives. He reads everything he can find about the Luftwaffe's operations over northern Germany in December 1944. He learns the names of the fighter units that were stationed near Bremen. He learns their histories, their commanding officers, their loss records. He narrows the list of possible pilots to 3 or 4 squadrons, but he cannot get any closer without the personal records that remain locked in archives he cannot access. In the summer of 1979, Fenton travels to Germany for the first time since the war. He flies from Winnipeg to Frankfurt, rents a car, and drives north to Bremen. The drive takes him through the German countryside, past neat villages and farmland and forests that look nothing like the landscape he saw from 20,000 feet in 1944. From the air, Germany was a patchwork of smoke and fire and the dark scars of bomb craters. From the ground, it is green and peaceful and impossibly ordinary. Bremen itself has been rebuilt so completely that Fenton barely recognizes it. The bomb craters are gone, replaced by office buildings and apartment blocks and shopping centers. The aircraft factory they targeted in December 1944 is now a commercial district with a department store and a parking structure. He stands on the sidewalk and tries to overlay the city he is seeing with the city he remembers, but the two images will not align. The Bremen in his memory is burning. The Bremen in front of him is selling shoes. He visits 2 former Luftwaffe airfields near the city. One has been turned into a farm, its runways plowed under and planted with rapeseed that covers the ground in bright yellow. A farmer tells him that pieces of concrete still turn up when they plow deep enough, and that his grandfather found an unexploded cannon shell in the hedgerow in 1961. The other airfield is a small regional airport serving prop planes and private charters. A young woman at the information desk looks at him with polite confusion when he asks about Messerschmitt operations in 1944. He talks to local historians, elderly residents, anyone who might remember the war. He shows them a hand-drawn map of the area where the encounter took place. He describes the German pilot's aircraft, the markings he can remember, the approximate time of day. He carries a folder of documents, photocopies of mission reports, navigation logs, weather charts. He has prepared for this trip the way he once prepared for a bombing mission, with meticulous attention to detail and the quiet knowledge that it will probably not be enough. Nobody can help. The war was 35 years ago. The people who lived through it have spent those 35 years trying to move on. The young people do not want to hear about it. Germany in 1979 is a prosperous, forward-looking country that has worked very hard to put the war behind it. An elderly Canadian asking questions about a Luftwaffe pilot from 1944 is a curiosity, nothing more. On his last evening in Bremen, Fenton walks to the Weser River and stands on the bank in the fading light. Somewhere above this spot, 35 years ago, a German pilot decided not to kill him. The sky's quiet now. Pleasure boats drift on the water. Children are playing on the opposite bank. Fenton looks up at the empty sky and feels, for the first time, the full weight of what he is trying to do. He is trying to find a ghost, a man who existed for 12 minutes in his life and then vanished into the largest war in human history. The odds are absurd. The task is impossible. He flies home to Winnipeg with nothing, but he does not stop. He cannot stop. The question has been with him for 35 years now, longer than his marriage, longer than his children's lives, longer than his career with the railway. It has become the defining fact of his existence, the thing that separates him from every other man who flew bombers over Germany. Other men came home with nightmares. Fenton came home with a mystery. In the autumn of 1979, everything changes because of a conversation at a dinner party. Fenton and Margaret are at the home of their neighbors, the Hendersons, for a Saturday evening meal. It is a small gathering, 6 people around a table, roast beef and potatoes, and the kind of easy conversation that happens between people who have known each other for 20 years. After dinner, over coffee and rye, Fenton mentions his recent trip to Germany. He does not explain why he went. He says only that he was visiting historical sites from the war. One of the other guests, a retired professor from the University of Manitoba, named Arthur Wilcox, asks what sites he visited. Fenton describes the airfields near Bremen. Wilcox asks if he flew bombers during the war. Fenton says yes. Wilcox leans forward with the particular interest of an academic who has found an unexpected source. It turns out that Wilcox has spent years researching Canadian airmen who served in Bomber Command. He has interviewed dozens of veterans. He is connected to a network of aviation historians in Britain, Germany, and the United States, and he knows something that Fenton does not. There is a newsletter. It is called the Combat Pilots Association Bulletin. It circulates among former fighter and bomber pilots from all the Allied and Axis nations. It is a small publication, mimeographed and stapled, produced by a retired American colonel in Virginia. But it reaches the right people. Former Luftwaffe pilots subscribe to it. Former Royal Air Force pilots subscribe to it. Former Royal Canadian Air Force pilots subscribe to it. If you want to find a specific pilot from the war, Wilcox says, this is the best way to do it. Write your story and send it to the bulletin. If the man is alive and reads it, he will find you. Fenton stares at Wilcox across the table. Then he asks for the address. 3 days later, he sits down at the kitchen table on Banning Street and begins to write. It takes him 2 full days to compose the letter because he wants every detail to be exact. He has been carrying the story inside him for 35 years, refining it, sharpening it, running it through his memory again and again until every element is as precise as he can make it. He lays out the date, December 17th, 1944. 19. He lays out the location, the skies over northern Germany, southeast of Bremen. He describes the mission, the flak damage, the fighter attacks, the condition of his Lancaster. He recounts the loss of 2 engines, the wounded crew, the slow descent toward the ground. And then he tells the part of the story he has never told anyone except Margaret. He describes the Messerschmitt Bf 109 that appeared on his port wing, the German pilot who signaled him to land, the escort through the coastal anti-aircraft batteries, the salute over the North Sea, and the 35 years he has spent looking for this man. He includes one specific detail that he hopes will distinguish his account from the thousands of other encounters that happened over Germany during the war. The German pilot, before turning away, held his salute for a long time. Not a quick wave, a deliberate, sustained salute, the kind one professional gives to another. It lasted 3 or 4 seconds, long enough that Fenton could see the pilot's face clearly through the canopy. A young man, clean-shaven, with dark hair. He seals the letter, addresses it to the Combat Pilots Association Bulletin in Virginia, and walks it to the post office on Portage Avenue. He drops it through the mail slot and stands there for a moment, his hand still on the metal flap, wondering if he is sending his last hope into the void. The letter is published in the January 1980 edition of the Bulletin. It runs on page 3 under a small headline. Fenton does not know how many people read it. He does not know if any former Luftwaffe pilots subscribe to the Bulletin. He does not know if the German pilot is still alive. He waits. January passes. February. March. The Winnipeg winter is brutal, even by Winnipeg standards. The temperature drops to -40 for a week in February, and Fenton shovels his driveway every morning and wonders if the German pilot ever experienced cold like this, or if his memories of cold are limited to the cockpit of a Messerschmitt at 20,000 feet. April arrives. The snow begins to melt. Fenton checks the mail every day, walking the same path from the front door to the mailbox by the street, the same path he has walked 10,000 times in 33 years of living on Banning Street. Bills, flyers, a letter from Catherine in Ottawa, a seed catalog from a garden supply company. Nothing from Germany, nothing from the Bulletin. By May, Fenton has begun to accept that the German pilot is dead. It has been 35 years. The man would be in his 60s now, at least, if he survived the war, if he survived the occupation, if he survived the decades since. The odds are against it. Over 90% of Luftwaffe fighter pilots were killed during the war. The ones who survived often died young from the accumulated toll of injuries, stress, and the particular kind of psychological damage that comes from fighting a war you know you are losing. Fenton is 60 years old. He has spent more than half his life looking for a man he met for 12 minutes in the sky over Germany. He begins to think that maybe the looking itself is the point. Maybe the answer to the question does not matter as much as the act of asking it. Maybe the German pilot's gift was not just the 12 minutes of mercy over Bremen, but the 35 years of wondering that followed. And then the letter arrives. The letter from Bavaria, The 5 words on a single sheet of paper. I believe I am him. The letter that is now sitting on the dining table in the house on Banning Street, in front of a 60-year-old man whose hands will not stop trembling. The writer's name is Karl Brandt. He is 63 years old. He is a retired schoolteacher who spent 30 years teaching mathematics and physics at a secondary school in Bavaria. He is a widower. His wife, Ingrid, died of cancer in 1976. He has 2 children, a son who is a doctor in Munich, and a daughter who lives in Hamburg. He is in good health, he writes, although his knees are not what they were. He recounts the encounter in detail that makes the hair stand up on the back of Fenton's neck. The date matches. The location matches. He recalls the crippled bomber, a 4-engine aircraft with severe damage to the nose and fuselage, trailing smoke from at least 1 dead engine. He recalls pulling alongside and seeing through the holes in the airframe the desperate condition of the crew inside. He recalls signaling the pilot to land, then to divert to Sweden. He recalls the pilot shaking his head both times. He recalls making the decision to escort the bomber through the coastal flak batteries, knowing that if anyone on the ground reported what he was doing, he would face a court-martial and almost certain execution. He recalls flying with the bomber all the way to the open sea, and he recalls the moment he pulled alongside for the last time and raised his hand in salute. He writes that he remembers the salute lasting a long time. He wanted the Canadian pilot to see his face. He wanted him to know that what was happening was deliberate, not accidental, that a human being had made a conscious choice to let him live. He explains that he never spoke of the incident. In Hitler's Germany, sparing an enemy aircraft was an act of treason punishable by death. He kept the secret through the rest of the war. He kept it through the chaos of Germany's defeat, through the occupation, through the slow, painful process of rebuilding a country from rubble. He became a teacher because he wanted to spend his life building something instead of destroying it. He married a woman who never knew what he had done over Bremen in December 1944. He writes that for 35 years he has carried one question: did the bomber make it home? Did the crew survive? Or did the Lancaster crash into the North Sea minutes after he turned away, making his act of mercy meaningless? He writes that when he read Fenton's letter in the bulletin, he wept. For the first time in 35 years, he had his answer. They survived. The crew made it home. His choice mattered. He closes the letter with a simple request. He would very much like to speak with Fenton, if Fenton is willing. He includes his telephone number. Fenton reads the letter 3 times. Then he puts it down on the table and stares at the wall. Margaret finds him sitting there 20 minutes later, the letter in front of him, tears running silently down his face. She reads it without speaking. Then she picks up the phone and dials the number. When Karl Brandt answers, Fenton can barely get the words out. His voice cracks. He manages 4 words that he has been waiting 35 years to say. You saved my life. There is silence on the line. Then Brandt's voice, quiet, accented, steady. I have waited a very long time to hear that. They talk for 3 hours. The long-distance charges will be enormous, and neither of them cares. Brandt walks Fenton through every detail of the encounter. His aircraft, a Bf-109 G6, with a tropical air filter still mounted from his earlier service in North Africa. The markings on the fuselage, a yellow number 7 on the cowling. The condition of his engine, which had been running rough after a cannon shell damaged the oil cooler in an earlier engagement that morning. He confirms things that Fenton has never shared with anyone: the direction of the approach, the way the flak batteries fell silent as he flew alongside the bomber, the exact point where he broke away over the open water with the Frisian Islands visible to the south. These are details that only the German pilot could know. Brandt tells Fenton about his commanding officer, a man named Major Werner Hoffmann, who had told his pilots early in the war that there was a difference between combat and murder. If a man is helpless, Hoffmann said, if he is in a parachute or a crippled aircraft, you do not fire. You are a fighter pilot, not an executioner. Brandt says that when he looked through the holes in the Lancaster's fuselage and saw the wounded crew inside, he heard Hoffmann's voice in his head, and he could not pull the trigger. By the end of the call, there is no doubt in either man's mind. Brandt is the pilot. The question that has haunted Fenton for 35 years finally has an answer. Not just an answer, a name, a voice. A human being on the other end of a telephone line in Bavaria who has been carrying the same 12 minutes for the same 35 years. Fenton hangs up the phone and sits at the kitchen table in the house on Banning Street. The same table where he ate breakfast this morning. The same table where his children did their homework. The same table where he has written hundreds of letters to archives and veterans associations and historians in half a dozen countries. He puts his head in his hands and he weeps. Margaret sits beside him and says nothing. There is nothing to say. 3 months later, in August 1980, James Fenton flies from Winnipeg to Munich. Karl Brandt meets him at the airport. A friend of Brandt's family brings a camera. The photograph taken that day will become the most important image in both men's lives. It shows 2 elderly men standing face to face in an airport arrivals hall. One is tall and thin, wearing a gray suit and a blue tie, his white hair combed neatly to the side. The other is shorter, stockier, wearing a brown jacket and an open-collared shirt. They are looking at each other with an expression that is impossible to misread. It is the expression of 2 men who have finally found what they have been looking for. In the photograph, they are about to embrace. Brandt has taken a half step forward, his arms beginning to open. Fenton is reaching out with his right hand, and it is not clear whether he intends to shake hands or pull the other man toward him. In the next frame, which the photographer captures a second later, the question is answered. They are holding each other, 2 old men weeping in a German airport, surrounded by travelers who have no idea what they are witnessing. Fenton stays in Bavaria for 10 days. They spend the time talking. They fill in the missing years, the decades of silence, the parallel lives lived on opposite sides of the Atlantic. Brandt shows him the school where he taught for 30 years. He shows him the house where he raised his children. He shows him the church where he married Ingrid in 1952. Fenton tells Brandt about Winnipeg, about the railway job and the house on Banning Street, and the 3 children and the hockey on Saturday mornings. He tells him about the nightmares that never stopped, the ones that always ended with the same image. The German pilot on the wing, the salute, the empty sky. Brandt says he had the same nightmares. The crippled bomber, the desperate crew, the young Canadian pilot staring at him through the glass, and always the question, did they make it? On the 3rd day, Fenton calls the surviving members of his crew. He reaches Pickering in Thunder Bay, Mackay in Charlottetown, Doucet in Trois-Rivières. He tells them he has found the German pilot. There is a long silence on each call, followed by the sound of grown men trying not to cry. Over the following months, Brandt meets them. He travels to Canada in the autumn of 1980 and visits each of the surviving crew members. He meets their wives, their children, their grandchildren. He meets families that exist because of a decision he made in 12 seconds over Bremen 36 years ago. In Thunder Bay, Thomas Pickering, the former lumberjack who manned the mid-upper turret, stands in his living room and introduces Brandt to his 4 children and 9 grandchildren. He gestures at the room full of people and says, "Karl, this is what you did." Brandt cannot speak. He sits down on the couch and covers his face with his hands. In Charlottetown, William Mackey, the wireless operator who once put out a fire with his bare palms, gives Brant a book of poetry. Inside the front cover, he has written, "For the man who gave us all our tomorrows." Andrew Lewicki, the rear gunner from Edmonton, the one who was carried from the turret on a stretcher and spent 4 months in hospital and walked with a cane for the rest of his life, is the last to meet Brant. He traveled from Edmonton to Winnipeg for the occasion. When Brant walks into Fenton's living room on Banning Street, Lewicki stands up from his chair, steadies himself on his cane, and takes 3 careful steps forward. He embraces the German pilot and does not let go. When he finally steps back, he looks him in the eye and says, "I owe you 36 years, and a bakery." Nobody in the room understands the joke except Fenton, who laughs so hard he has to sit down. Over the next 15 years, James Fenton and Carl Brant become as close as brothers. Closer, perhaps, because their bond was forged in a moment that most brothers will never share. They write to each other every week. Long letters, handwritten, in a mix of English and the few German phrases Fenton has learned. They talk on the phone every Sunday morning, Fenton calling from the kitchen on Banning Street, Brant answering from his study in Prien am Chiemsee. The long-distance bills are staggering. Margaret jokes that the phone company should name a satellite after them. They visit each other's homes. Fenton travels to Bavaria at least once a year, staying in Brant's spare bedroom, eating Brant's terrible cooking, walking with him through the alpine foothills that surround the town. Brant comes to Winnipeg twice, once in summer and once in winter. The winter visit nearly kills him. He steps off the plane at Winnipeg International Airport in February, feels the -35-degree wind hit his face, and turns to Fenton with an expression of genuine horror. "James," he says, "this is worse than the cockpit." Their families become intertwined. Brant's son, the doctor in Munich, corresponds with Fenton's daughter Catherine in Ottawa. Brant's daughter visits Winnipeg and stays with the Fentons for a week. Margaret and Brant develop their own friendship, separate from the men's bond, built on letters and phone calls and the shared understanding that they are both married to men who were broken by the same war and healed by the same reunion. They tell their story at veterans gatherings and air shows across Canada and Europe. They stand together on stages in front of audiences of old soldiers and young students and tell the story of December 17th, 1944. The crippled bomber, the German fighter on the wing, the salute over the North Sea, the 35 years of searching, the letter, the phone call, the embrace in a German airport. Not everyone understands. Some of Fenton's old squadron mates refuse to attend the events. They fought a war against Germany, they say, and they do not want to shake hands with a man who wore a Luftwaffe uniform. Brant receives letters from Germany calling him a traitor. One anonymous letter accuses him of dishonoring the memory of German pilots who died fighting for their country. Neither man cares. They have spent too many decades carrying the same 12 minutes in silence. Now they carry them together, and the weight is halved. In 1988, Brant gives Fenton a book. It is a German edition of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Night Flight, a story about a pilot who flies alone through storms and darkness. Inside the front cover, in his careful handwriting, Brant has written an inscription. In 1943, I lost my younger brother, Wilhelm, over the English Channel. I thought the war took everything from me. Then I found you. You gave me back a brother, your brother, Carl. Fenton keeps the book on his bedside table for the rest of his life. In the spring of 1995, Carl Brant falls ill. It begins with a persistent cough that he dismisses as nothing. the kind of cough that men of his generation wave away because they have survived things far worse than a tickle in the chest. By autumn, it is diagnosed as lung cancer, advanced and inoperable. The doctors in Munich give him 6 months. He calls Fenton from the hospital to tell him. His voice is steady, the voice of a man who faced death in a cockpit at 20,000 feet and is not afraid of facing it again in a hospital bed. Fenton is on a plane within 48 hours. Margaret drives him to the airport and watches him walk through the departure gate, a 72-year-old man moving with the urgent, purposeful stride of a young flight sergeant who has just been told his wingman is down. She knows she will not see Karl Brandt alive again. She stands at the window until the plane disappears into the clouds. He stays in Germany for 3 weeks. He sits beside Brandt's bed every day, reading to him from the book of poetry that William Mackey gave them, talking about nothing and everything, filling the silence with the sound of a voice that Brandt has come to know as well as his own. Some days Brandt is strong enough to sit up and talk. Other days he sleeps, and Fenton sits in the chair beside the bed and watches the rise and fall of his chest, and remembers another time when he watched a German and wondered if the next breath would be the last. Brandt's children visit every day. His son, the doctor, explains the medical details in a clinical tone that breaks only once. When he steps into the hallway and Fenton follows him and finds him leaning against the wall with his eyes closed. Brandt's daughter brings flowers from the garden in Prien am Chiemsee and arranges them on the windowsill the way her mother used to. On the last day, Brandt takes Fenton's hand and says, "You know, James, I have been thinking about that day, and I believe I did not spare your bomber because of what Hoffman taught me, or because of the rules of war, or because of anything I was told. I believe I spared your bomber because when I looked through the glass and saw your face, I saw my brother." Karl Brandt dies on November 2nd, 1995, in Munich, Germany. He is 78 years old. James Fenton flies to Bavaria for the funeral. He stands at the grave of the man who saved his life and says nothing. The silence stretches. Then he reaches into his pocket and takes out a small object. It is the photograph of Margaret that he carried in his breast pocket on every bombing mission. The photograph that was with him on December 17th, 1944, when a German pilot appeared on his wing and chose mercy instead of murder. He places it on the coffin. "She would want you to have it," he says. "You saved the man who gave her everything." 14 months later, on January 11th, 1997, James Fenton dies in his home on Banning Street in Winnipeg, Manitoba. He is 74 years old. Margaret is holding his hand. On the bedside table, next to the lamp and the glass of water and the reading glasses he no longer needs, is the German edition of Night Flight that Karl Brandt gave him in 1988. The inscription inside the front cover is smudged from years of handling. Margaret has seen him read it hundreds of times, running his thumb over the words, and she has never once asked him what it says, because she already knows. At the funeral, the minister reads a passage that Catherine chose. The church on Edmonton Street is full. Men from the railway sit alongside men from the Air Force. Fenton's hockey players, now grown men with children of their own, fill 2 rows near the back. Thomas Pickering has flown in from Thunder Bay. William Mackey has come from Charlottetown. Henri Doucet has driven from Trois-Rivières. They sit together in the front pew, 3 old men who once flew a burning bomber across the North Sea, and they do not speak during the service because they do not trust their voices. Margaret receives a letter from Brandt's son in Munich 2 weeks later. Inside is a photograph she has never seen. It was taken by Karl Brandt in 1988 during one of his visits to Winnipeg. It shows Fenton standing in the backyard of the house on Banning Street, looking up at the sky. He is smiling. On the back in Brandt's handwriting are 3 words in German. Mein Bruder James. My brother James. They are buried in different countries, on different continents, in different soil. Fenton lies in Brookside Cemetery in Winnipeg, under the wide prairie sky he grew up watching. Brandt lies in a small churchyard in Prien am Chiemsee, in the shadow of the Bavarian Alps. They are separated by 5,000 miles of land and ocean. But their story is the same story. 2 men who met for 12 minutes in the worst moment of the worst war in history. 2 men who spent 35 years searching for each other across oceans and decades, and the wreckage of a world that tried to make them enemies. And when they finally found each other, they did not waste a single day. 35 years of searching, 15 years of brotherhood, and 1 salute over the North Sea that outlasted everything the war tried to destroy. This story is inspired by the real events of the Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler incident of December 1943, in which a German Luftwaffe pilot spared a crippled American B-17 bomber and its crew over Germany. The 2 men reunited in 1990 after a decades-long search and remained close friends until their deaths in 2008. Names, nationalities, aircraft, and certain details have been changed for this dramatization.